If you were a similar age to me, you probably started getting into film during the mid to late 90s, and Kevin Smiths were a big part of your blossoming love of movies. With the release of the Jay and Bob reboot in 2019, I had planned to do a massive 3-part retrospective on his entire career, reviewing every film he'd ever made, split into the 3 distinct periods of his career I believed at that time existed. I got around to writing the first part of this series, put it on the back burner, and never got any further with it. I wanted to watch Clerks 3 with it being on Netflix at the moment, so I thought I'd kill 2 birds with 1 stone this week and review that film, while simultaneously commenting on the 3 prior phases of Smith's career and how this film fits into a possible new 4th phase. Firstly, let's tackle those first 3 phases of his career. The initial phase covers his first 4 films being the original Clerks, Mallrats, Chasing Amy and Dogma. It's what I like to call Smith's initial indie darling cult success phase. It's not very catchy, but hey, that's what I'm going with, as it basically sums this period up perfectly. Each of these films are, I believe, relatable to almost everyone, and are in part each based on a different aspect of life most people will have experience with, just dialing them up to 10 for comedic effect. Clerks is a film about work, especially working in retail. If you've ever had a retail job, Clerks is less a farcical comedy and more a documentary. It's just that damn relatable to me because I worked in a convenience store for a number of years that was much like the Quick Stop, even up to the point where someone tried killing me once because I caught them shoplifting. Hence I prefer the nihilistic alternative ending where Dante dies. Mallrats is about that time in life when you are technically an adult but still kind of act like a child and don't really want to fully commit to adulthood quite yet. You just want to sit around and play Nintendo and hang around with your friends like you did in the good old days, but you still want to get laid, so you gotta grow up a little bit and find a comfortable middle ground between the 2 extremes. Again, perfectly relatable as a self-professed 40-year-old man-child with a Lego collection. Chasing Amy is about love and relationships, and again, relatable to most people who have ever had one. Especially the kind of relationship that you know and everyone else knows is toxic as fuck and leading nowhere, but you just don't want to let go for whatever reason. The 4th and final film of this phase is Dogma, a film about religion, which most people, even atheists, who grew up in the Western world can relate to because we are all kind of exposed to Christianity via cultural osmosis. I think this phase is his most productive, where every single film I've seen multiple times and still rewatch regularly even now because they are all great films. In this first phase, I always consider him little more than a competent director, and in my opinion, a fairly good, sometimes brilliant writer, which we have to keep in mind when we enter the attempted breakout into the mainstream commercial success phase of his career, which starts with Jay and Silent Bob Strikes Back and ends with Cop Out. Although you could make an argument for the fact it really ended with Zack and Miri Make a Porno, as Cop Out is more a director for hire gig than an actual legit Kevin Smith film. This is the phase of his career where he was given bigger budget studio films and found that no matter the budget or the stars attached, his films made between $25 and $35 million at the box office, or in his own words, they did Kevin Smith numbers. It also includes the only 2 films of his I've still never seen. Here's the thing though, it shouldn't be that surprising he never really achieved mainstream success, because the first in this series of films was Jay and Silent Bob, which is kind of semi-autobiographical to Smith's life, but isn't really as relatable to a general audience as his initial 4 films were. It's also an incredibly self-referential film to Smith's prior work. You need to have seen the earlier View Askew-universe films to get a lot of the in-jokes that are included. It's an early noughties comedy film, aimed at a general audience, budget-wise, with a script written for Kevin Smith fans, which was then followed up by Jersey Girl, a film that wasn't at all set in the View Askew-universe, didn't feature Jay and Silent Bob, and ended up appealing to neither his existing fans nor a general audience, who who I'm sure by this point had preconceived notions of what a Kevin Smith film was, so didn't get out to watch it, and neither did I. A return to familiar ground and form with the low-budget Clerks 2 followed, but what really killed this phase of his career is Zack and Miri Make a Porno, a film I really enjoyed, but just for whatever reason it never really made it at the box office, as Smith himself has said about this film. That was supposed to be the one that punched us through to the next level. Everyone thought it would do $60 to $70 million, and it wound up doing Kevin Smith business. I was like, I'm done. Due to this, his relationship with the Weinsteins soured, and the last film in this phase of his career, Cop Out, is ironically his most successful at the box office as a director, but he didn't write it, and he himself has said multiple times it was one of the most miserable experiences of his life. Thus starts the third phase of his career, the weed-fueled return to the Indies. This is kind of the most interesting period, where he makes some really interesting choices, and then ends with an almost unwatchable, awful Nepo vehicle for his daughter. Red State, the first film, was a straight horror, is a pretty good film, and created a whole bunch of controversy because Smith initially said he'd auction the rights to the film off, before reneging on that pledge and selling the film to himself before self-publishing it, which is actually a fairly unique way of marketing and selling his films, but does really limit the audience for them to people willing to pay to go, hear Kevin speak, and then watch the movie, so essentially his American-based fans. The second production in this phase is Tusk, a film based on a weed-induced rabbit hole he and Scott Mosier, his longtime producer and friend, went down on their podcast. A film that is either the best thing Smith has done since his early work, or one of the worst films to have ever been made. There is no middle ground seemingly on this one. It's definitely weird, is all I will say here. His next film is definitely his worst, and seems to only exist so he could give his daughter and her friend, Johnny Depp's daughter, jobs. I can find no other justification for this film to exist. Which brings us to a possible fourth phase of his career with the Jay and Silent Bob Reboot and Clerks 3, both made after he had a massive, almost fatal heart attack in 2018. Jay and Silent Bob Reboot was a very self-referential flick that really relies on the viewer being a huge fan of Smith's prior work, and if you aren't, then I can't imagine you'd get anything from it. As a huge fan of his work, especially the earlier Viewer Skewniverse stuff, I found it a fairly funny ride down memory lane. I was never bored by it, so I'm interested going into Clerks 3 if it also fits that trend, or is it something entirely different. I honestly wrote up to this part of the script before I watched the film, and now I kind of wish I watched the film first because I actually like to recommend these movies. I hate being overly critical in these kinds of videos, but man, I did not enjoy Clerks 3. Yeah, it's self-referential and meta as all fuck, but in a bad way, not a fun jaunt down memory lane way. It just confronted me with the reality that he has actually regressed, both as a writer and a filmmaker over the last 30 years. The first thing you're going to notice is that this film is horrible to look at. Say what you will about shooting on actual film, but it hides a lot of sins, especially shooting in black and white, whereas shooting on digital, if it's not lit well or colour corrected in post correctly, or any number of other issues with the various cameras being used, it can look really flat, dull and boring. I want you to take a look at these shots side by side, one from Clerks 2 and one from Clerks 3, and these shots of Clerks and Clerks 3, literally, anyone with eyes can tell one does not look like the others, and in a very bad way. It makes the film look cheap in comparison, even though the budget for this was considerably more than the prior two Clerks films combined. Added to this is the fact that a lot of Smith's scenes in his movies are basically locked off camera shots with actors arranged in simple compositions, then they give a dialogue dump. And that's not a criticism of those films, because the dialogue was often witty and engaging in those early films, so it didn't really matter that the shots were composed that way, as you were taken in by the dialogue and carried along for the ride. In this, most of the scenes are similarly shot, but they had at least 2 cameras to choose from in editing, instead of just one, and Smith, who is the only credited editor on this, flicks between the two like he's got ADHD, and the editing controls are a fidget spinner. It makes scenes really choppy and means they have no rhythm to them. Most people aren't experts in editing and wouldn't know a J cut from an L cut to a straight cut if their lives depended on it, but they have probably seen thousands of hours of film, so subconsciously know when all of those things are used incorrectly, and this film is going to have your Spidey editing senses tingling the whole time. That's a really long-winded way to say this film looks like ass, and is really badly edited. As for the dialogue, I think I chuckled maybe 5 times and actually laughed out loud once. Smith's best films were saccharine sweet stories coated in dick jokes and pop culture references, and I'm absolutely here for that. But this whole film is just a meta-commentary on Smith and his life, and is already really weirdly dated by its own pop culture references only a year after it was released, due to there being numerous jokes about NFTs. Because you remember those 3 weeks 2 years ago where they were the next big thing, right? Well, look forward to 10 unfunny jokes about that. The entire plot of the film can be summarized like this. Randall has a massive heart attack and decides he's wasted his entire life working in a video store watching films. We will forget Clerks 2 where he worked in fast food, but whatever, he's going to make a movie about working in a convenience store. This sounds awfully familiar. Look, he just makes Clerks. Yes, the original Clerks. Shot for shot, he makes that. This means that pretty much the whole second half of the 100-minute runtime is recreations of scenes from Clerks, but directed by Randall, with the same actors, who are now 30 years older. But for me, all that second half of the film did was remind me how much he has regressed as a filmmaker from that original Clerks movie, and just how much better Clerks is than this film. And they're just literal recreations with no thought put into how a movie made by a 20-something convenience store worker would be made in 2022 or 2023. What would that film look like? How would they fund it? How would they even find distribution, etc.? Instead, Randall's fictitious film is shot on a budget of $27,000 in black and white in 21 days. Because that's how much it cost to shoot Clerks and how long it took, and we get this justification of whites in black and white from Silent Bob.
No, I'm a fucking filmmaker. And any filmmaker worth their salt would know that the colors in this place are fucking ghastly.
And yet, as I already mentioned, this film looks like total ass. Even the black and white recreations of Clerks look worse than the originals, and they are 30 years old and from Smith's very first film. So all these recreations do is show how nobody here has actually progressed in the prior 30 years, and in Kevin's case, have seriously regressed, because at least back in the day he could operate a camera and write quippy and witty dialogue. Like, I get it, Kevin Smith almost died of a massive heart attack, and this is probably really personal to him, and there are some really emotional high points for sure, but they are cheap, meta-emotional high points. They all rely on you already being a huge fan of these characters from previous, way better movies, rather than them being well-crafted narrative high points within this story. Plus knowing the meta behind the narrative that Kevin Smith had a massive, almost fatal heart attack, which a lot of people just aren't going to know. Added to all this, the acting varies wildly from really terrible, especially whenever this guy is on screen, to I appreciated the effort whenever Brian O'Halloran or Jeff Anderson are, but still, they haven't particularly improved as actors over the last 3 decades. We also don't get anywhere near enough snoochie boochies from the comedic pairing that is Jay and Silent Bob. I expect at least one outrageous scene in a Kevin Smith movie, and this doesn't have any of that. It's much like the cinematography, sadly flat, dull and lifeless. I really hope Kevin goes back to making weird, but at least interesting movies like Tusk or Red State, and abandons this meta self-referential circle jerk phase of his career after only 2 flicks. Oh, and find somebody who can tell him how to use a bloody digital camera. Well, this took a turn for the unexpected because I genuinely thought I'd enjoy this movie and was so confident I would. I wrote half the script without even bothering to see it first, and looking around the internet, a lot of fans did love this, so maybe you will be one of those, and I really hope you are. As for me, I recommend you go back and watch Clerks 1 and 2, because they are still great. If you enjoyed that, then like, comment, and subscribe.